Well, actually, both my parents were immigrants to South Africa. My mother as a refugee from Nazi Germany. She was German-Jewish from a family that had been in Frankfurt for certainly at least 500 years. And then in the mid-1930s, she realized she really needed to leave. And at first attempted to go to Britain, but was turned away, and then went to South Africa, largely because her brother had gone there ahead of her and was able to promise that he would make sure that she would not be a burden on the state financially. And then the two of them were able to do the same thing for their parents in 1938. My father was a Scottish Jew who traveled to South Africa to write about Johannesburg's 50th anniversary in 1936. And the years of my growing up, he was the editor-in-chief of the country's first multiracial mass circulation newspaper, which was essentially a newspaper for the black population in the Johannesburg area, and also of a magazine called Drum Magazine that went all over Africa. So he had a very unusual access to the lives of black South Africans. Most of his reporters were black South Africans, and particularly with politically aware black South Africans. I also grew up with the police watching our home, learning how to spot a policeman, learning never to say anything at any time, what my parents were doing, where they were, who my dad was seeing, being careful to answer the phone. If someone said, "Where's your father? Can I talk to him?" I would just say, "I don't know," even if I knew exactly where he was. So it was a time of a lot of pressure, partly on the journalists, just because journalists tended to know things that the South African police would like to know.
And so, were you a journalist first and then a novelist?
I think I was a novelist first and then started getting interested in journalism later. So I've done a fair amount of writing for magazines, and mostly it's been matters of personal interest or a strong interest in South Africa and finding out what's going on there and returning there.
So as an American citizen now, you've written this piece that describes surprise that Donald Trump has been elected, and then maybe not so surprising.
Well, it starts with the fact that a lot of my African friends were not at all surprised that Donald Trump was elected, because they said, we've seen this guy before, we've seen a certain populist kind of approach, we've seen a way that someone talks that worked in our country, and now you're dealing with it. And I'm going to backtrack a little bit, because I think there are actually a lot more parallels between South Africa and America than most Americans realize. There was a period where South Africa was referred to as the liberal colony because they'd outlawed slavery, and the US had not done that yet. And then you go back and forth. In the apartheid days, South Africa was viewed as much less liberal than once the changeover and there was a full voting rights for all people as opposed to whites-only voting, and we had Nelson Mandela's inauguration. Then South Africa is seen as swinging in the liberal direction again in terms of politics and race. Parallels are never perfect. They're never, things are never going to be exactly the same, but I think it can help us understand a little bit of what we're dealing with and what we're going through by seeing how a country with certain similarities has either suffered from or transcended moments of political change. One of the major shifts just in terms of political clout is when the disposable income of black South Africans became greater than the disposable income of whites. Well, when you have 80% of the population, that shouldn't be surprising. But 1985 has been pinpointed as the key year that happened. And with growing political awareness, what was done is that there were very focused boycotts of either businesses or groups that were seen as being encouraging a racist, white supremacist agenda. For example, when I was a kid, black South Africans often could not go in the front door of a business establishment. There'd be a side door for them. Well, if someone is no longer getting any business, they're very quick to welcome everyone in the front door. P.W. Botha was the Prime Minister who was expected to make a speech in 1985 when he was expected to talk about getting rid of a lot of what was known as petty apartheid. And petty apartheid was things like whites-only benches, city parks where only whites were allowed, whites-only toilets, whites-only hospitals. And the expectation of everybody is things are changing, progress is happening, and he's going to make a speech. Now, he started looking at his political base and realized that a lot of that political base was threatened by these very changes. So rather than embracing and encouraging these changes, he threw everyone for a loop and said, we're going to stop progress. He doesn't call it progress, he called it something opposite. He said, no, we're going to hold on to the way we've done things, it's much better, and I'm not going to be intimidated, and I know people want me to change, but this is the way we're going to do things. And it at first had a very chilling effect on people who were trying to encourage change, and it also resulted in a state of emergency with a lot of crackdowns on people who were either demonstrating against this stance or on political activists who were trying to present a different point of view. And it led to a period of considerable violence for about 2 years. And then things started shifting over again. And I think for me, one of the points of hope about when you see a certain sliding back in terms of the race relations in America, where you see more hostility on the streets, more discomfort between people of different races. You see attacks on Muslims, you see attacks on people of color, you see counterattacks on the police.
Or Trump supporters.
Or Trump supporters, and I know there has been violence against Trump supporters. That was certainly mirrored in South Africa. And then those things start shifting because in reality the change has happened. And you can try to stop the clock, you can pretend the clock has stopped, but I do believe there are actually times in history where just people's thinking has changed. It's certainly changed in younger people. Actually, another parallel, I think, in South Africa was that the majority of black South Africans were actually under 16, and they became leaders in terms of the political movement. And I think what we're seeing now is we're seeing a kind of very different sensibility among teenagers, among people in their early 20s, who are much more comfortable with issues of race or LGBTQ issues, and are really not going back to older ways of thinking or more entrenched kind of preformed and prejudged ways of thinking.